Hello everyone, or no one, Overnight Siren here, to dump all my thoughts into another long video that I don't anticipate many, if any, people will actually watch all the way through. This time the subject is Final Fantasy XVI, the newest mainline title in the long-running Final Fantasy series. I've actually loosely scripted out my thoughts ahead of time for once, and this is in an effort to try and keep this as a concise and cohesive video and to have some semblance of structure because I know I have a tendency to kind of jump all over the place. First and foremost, this is a spoiler warning for the whole video. I am going to be jumping all over the place, and of course this video will have spoilers for all sections of the main story. So let's dive in. First and foremost, I would like to give some background about me. I am a Final Fantasy fanboy with a capital F, fully, forever, and always. My cousin came to stay with us one week in the summer when I was like 8 or 9 years old, and he brought with him Final Fantasy VIII. Now, I had never seen a game like that. I'd only really seen fighting games and racing games and Crash Bandicoot. The graphics, the story, the music, they were all something I had never seen before. He was stuck at the section of the game where you have to locate the white seed ship, so it's not like it was the most exciting gameplay at the time, or in that game, but even just seeing him traverse this large world full of fantasy monsters and colorful characters, I think that was the moment that the nerd switch really went on in my head. And that Christmas, I asked my mom to buy me Final Fantasy. I didn't really know what the VII was at the end of the game, so I didn't really know it was part of a series. I just knew that was a game called Final Fantasy. So my mom got me the only two she could find, Final Fantasy IX and Final Fantasy Tactics. Now obviously neither game was the one I had seen months prior, but I got so hooked onto both of these games that they cemented this series as probably the most formative media franchise of my entire life, with Final Fantasy IX in particular becoming my favorite IP of all time, be it video games, movies, TV shows, literally anything. Now since then, I've played the series super faithfully. I buy each new release as they come out, and typically when I do buy a new console, it's because I have to, because the new Final Fantasy is coming out on it. I didn't have a PS4 until I had to because 15 was coming out, and I didn't have a PS5 until 16 was coming out, and thankfully my loving free company crowdfunded one for me for my birthday. All of this is just to say I am a fan of this series first and foremost, so all of my criticisms, they come from a place of love for this series and from just a disappointment when one of the games falls short of my own tastes. I'm not saying anyone's wrong for liking it, and likewise, I just expect that anyone that does watch this and does stumble across it accepts that these are just my opinions as a passionate endorser of the series, and I'm not just some random hater. Now, again, I've been a huge fan of this series, but Final Fantasy XV was a major disappointment for me. I'd initially not been super excited for that game based on what I had seen, but I got this random surge of excitement in the months leading up to the release, only to feel a crushing disappointment when I played the unfinished game as it came out. Because of my experience with 15, I tried my hardest to avoid any personal hype for 16. I knew I'd buy it, but I tried not to watch any of the pre-release gameplay videos. I just watched the trailers and read a little about the world so I wouldn't be caught off guard by any new verbiage. In fact, I didn't even pre-order the game until a week before the release, and I didn't play the demo until just a few days before the actual release. When I did play the demo, it gave me extremely high hopes. The demo had given me all the hype I was trying to avoid previously. The gameplay felt fun and cinematic. I could see how it had the potential to eventually become repetitive, but I just knew that as the game evolved, it would surely become very complex. I became so hyped by the demo that I even pre-ordered a second copy of the game from a different retailer just to make sure I'd get my copy on day one. And then the game got here. So let's break it down. With the game now beaten, I can honestly say if you were expecting Final Fantasy XVI to be a return to form, in my opinion, you'd be sadly mistaken. Final Fantasy XVI is a character action game that made the mistake of being over 50 hours long. The problem with 50-hour long character action games is that they outlive their welcome after about 10 or 20 hours, particularly if the action is dry and easily repeatable, which this game is guilty of on both counts. It looks pretty, but it becomes an increasingly unsatisfying experience. I know a lot of people are probably going to click off right now, but I hope you at least listen a little longer as I flesh out my opinions fully. Maybe I'll change your mind, maybe you'll pick up on a point of mine that you can comment on below and change my mind. I'm never opposed to having my mind changed. Again, these are just my opinions. Before I delve into anything, I'll come right out of the gate with how I feel, just so there's no mystery. I didn't enjoy the game overall. Like any Final Fantasy release, there's a lot of discourse surrounding it, and one point I see made again and again is this is not a Final Fantasy game. Well, it is. It has Final Fantasy in the title, so I won't say it's not, but I do get what they mean. A lot of this game's more ardent defenders are quick to say, oh, well people just say that because it's not turn-based, and I really don't think that's what people are saying. The game is lacking the RPG elements, which I'll expand on later, but to me, I sympathize most with the "it's not a Final Fantasy game" crowd when it comes to the tone of the game. Final Fantasy is goofy and full of charm, intermixed with fantasy action set pieces and sweeping romances. The worlds and stories have their dark parts, but overall they're packed with charisma and usually a fair degree of whimsy. These are worlds we want to be whisked away to, with characters we want to befriend. Who wants to go to Valisthea? 16 is just constant morose and depression, and everyone is painfully serious for almost its entire runtime, while also being action-packed. So while yes, Final Fantasy is this,
fortress is lost! We must withdraw!
it's also this. And both parts are essential to making something feel like a Final Fantasy installment, and that's where 16 misses the mark. So I do want to start with something that I have nothing negative to say about, and that's the graphics. I don't play many games, admittedly. I'm one of those people who returns to the same few comfort games every year or so, but otherwise just plays the newest Pokemon, the newest Final Fantasy, the newest Metal Gear Solid, and other big hype games that come across my radar, like Nier Automata and Persona 5. Aside from that, I spend most of my time in Final Fantasy XIV and Final Fantasy XI. That being said, based on my limited expertise, this is the best looking game I have ever played. Even in action mode, the game looks great. I often find that even in 4K HD TVs, it doesn't really make much of a difference to me, so maybe something's just wrong with my eyes. But I noticed very little difference between the new graphics option in Final Fantasy XVI versus the frame rate option, and that let me choose the frame rate priority mode without feeling like I was missing out on a visual marvel, because in my opinion, I still got a visual marvel. The only complaint I do have, which isn't a complaint about the graphics, but just about the options in the game, the fact that the motion blur was not an option to turn off in a day one patch was a major miss for me. The motion blur did hurt my eyes a little bit, and especially towards the end of the game as I was racing to finish before it got spoiled for me, I really would have loved the option to turn off the motion blur, but that patch came out unfortunately after I was already done with the experience. Before getting into some of the heavier stuff like the gameplay and the story, stuff I think I can actually kind of rationalize more, I do want to briefly touch on something that is entirely subjective and again, just my opinion, the music. My mind is blown that Final Fantasy XIV and this game have the same composer. I, like pretty much everyone else who's played it, love Final Fantasy XIV's soundtrack. But for 16, I really couldn't tell you a single track from it besides the Titan battle, I'm pretty sure. I'm guessing the soundtrack issues came from maybe a wide appeal angle they were going for, because it did sound like a movie trailer almost the entire time. Generic bombast that pretty much goes nowhere, just throwing as many horns and choir vocals as you can at everything. Final Fantasy has always been a series relying heavily on memorable melodic lines, and this game has none of them. There's no theme of love, no To Zanarkand, no battle on the big bridge, no You're Not Alone, no Melodies of Life, no Aerith's theme, no Dancing Mad. There's just nothing like that. There's not a song from this game that is going to give me nostalgia in 10 or 20 years. And again, that's just my opinion. Now that everyone's clicked off of this video, or the people who have remained have their pitchforks out, let's really get into the muck. I did enjoy the demo, but the more I played of the game, the more I became convinced that it was unfinished. Maybe even as unfinished as Final Fantasy XV, but certainly better at hiding it due to zeroing in entirely on the story. One thing I can say to kind of put a linchpin in the entire next section is that this game is shallow and easy. I am going to expand on both of those points. So let me explain. First, with the shallow aspect. In the overworld of Final Fantasy XVI, what you see is exactly what you get. It's nothing like older games where you can find great items via exploration. There's really no hidden paths or hidden items. There's no special stuff. You'll go to an area of the map that's off the beaten path, and you'll find basically nothing but duplicates of crafting materials that you end up having thousands of. Expanding on the crafting, that's another thing that makes this gameplay very shallow, the itemization. It is truly awful. And the awful itemization makes exploration of the world of Valisthea an even bigger and more pointless chore. The gear you can craft with all the worthless items you find are just stat sticks with no secondary effects or specific properties. Swords grant higher attack and stagger. Armor grants higher defense and HP. There's no status ailments, no elements, no added effects like auto barrier, shell, or haste. There's not even any kind of variation in stats on the gear. Like, it's not like you'll have a sword that has high attack but low stagger, or vice versa, or an accessory with low defense but high HP. Every piece of equipment you get is an objective improvement over the last. It's just fluff that serves as the illusion of progression, while giving no room for interesting or meaningful decision making outside of your accessories, which you can't craft. Coupled with the fact that every major story beat gives you a new crafting material that gives you an objectively better weapon than what you would have had before anyway. It makes exploration even less important, because progressing through the story will just give you something objectively better soon enough. Another ding towards exploration, and a reason that the gameplay is shallow, is that every vendor sells the same thing except for some difference in orchestrion rolls and lesser duplicates of generic accessories that grant X amount of additional damage or reduce cooldown for a specific skill. If you opt not to explore, when you do stay on the main path, you just go from cutscene to cutscene, with some running and fighting in between. Everything feels scripted and empty because the enemy camps are always at the exact same locations with the exact same enemies at each camp. And there are invisible walls everywhere, so the game really starts to feel like you're just on rails. Side quests are a bad joke without any depth or challenge. I mean, side quests were never blockbuster quest lines, but this is just ridiculous. They provide some okay world building, but they really don't give you anything interesting or challenging in the way of gameplay. Now, going back to when I said the gameplay was shallow and easy, I want to explore what I meant on easy and expand on that. Obviously, it is subjective, but these are my thoughts. The combat, in theory, is okay, but they implemented it in the worst possible way. Being able to learn an enemy's movements so you can then dodge perfectly without the need for a telegraph and counterattack is a great mechanic. However, there's so little variety in the enemy models that their attacks become so easy to read that this just becomes tedious and repeatable and predictable. The whole system is built around the idea of you basically just spamming square and seeing an epic fight. And again, because the game has so few enemy models, it just makes gameplay between bosses even easier, because you've seen these enemies hundreds and hundreds of times by hour 20. And it's not like the enemies are getting new mechanics or abilities as the game progresses. Those flower enemies you see at the beginning are the same flower enemies from the end, maybe with a different color palette. So it's not like they're getting new mechanics or abilities to keep things fresh, yet all the while, Clive is getting new abilities. So you're actively outpacing the already weak enemies, to the point that the fights become nothing but trivial. The enemies are using the same abilities they did on hour 5, with no variation, while Clive gets a new arsenal every couple of hours. New ways to beat the same enemies. The normal enemy camps are also spread out enough that by the time you go to the next camp, your abilities are already off cooldown. At most, camps have 4 to 5 enemies, so by the time you get the third icon, you'll have access to 6 abilities. These abilities can each basically one-shot an enemy. So what you do is you go to a camp, one-shot each of the enemies with a different icon ability. By the time you get to the next camp, oh, my icon abilities are off cooldown. Use 1 each again to kill each enemy, rinse and repeat. You seldom have to auto-attack, and when you can just lunge with an auto-attack so it does a finish anyway, while the enemy's lying on the ground not attacking you. And even when they do attack you, they do so little damage that it may as well not attack at all. The icons do have big special abilities like Diamond Dust and Earth's Fury or Earth and Fury, but those are really not useful either, because they take up a standard ability slot and mess up the combat rotation with their long cooldowns. And the difficulty of boss fights isn't really much harder in my opinion, because even if you lose a boss fight, you restart the fight with full life and full potions while the boss only has half his life, and there's not an option to turn this off. It's like you're being treated like a child. A little earlier I did mention that this game seems unfinished, and I think for me the tell for that was that most of this game's number systems are simply not tuned correctly, which has led to it becoming shallow and easy. There's no incentive to craft 90% of the time, there's standardized level ups, and mountains of gil with nothing to spend it on. Honestly, at mid-game, I even found that AP was no longer very useful, because you can just respec into whatever you want at any time with the amount you have already. So it's not like you are ever in a situation where you dump all your AP into one ability only to realize, oh man, that doesn't fit with my playstyle, or that doesn't gel with the way I play, and then you have to go and grind a lot more AP to make up for the stuff you just lost. The game systems are just loose, baggy, and sometimes even pointless. There's really no challenge, no strategy, no need for grinding, and no need for farming. I think I realized that I just need a bit more freedom. I need goals to work towards. In Final Fantasy XVI, I feel like the only reason to play and fight is to move the story forward, to get to the next cutscene. There's no distractions from the fighting, other than fetch quests, which are awful. Now, if I didn't lose people for my discussion of the music, I'm really going to lose them now. This is going to be the most divisive part of the video. I'm going to talk about the story. One thing I've heard a lot in defense of this game is that the gameplay wasn't for me, but the amazing story made it worth it. And I kind of have to ask, was it amazing? I kind of have to disagree. For me, the storytelling has always been just as important, if not more so, than the story itself. While I do think the story of Final Fantasy XVI is interesting when briefly summarized on paper, it really fails in its execution in almost every way. I think the thing that irks me the most about this game is there's no journey. You're going to hear me say that a lot in this section. I think the game actually would have been better if it had been more focused. Not to say more linear necessarily, but more focused. Final Fantasy XVI loses the journey feeling that made every previous FF so special. I don't feel at the end like I've come so far, because I spend so much time running between the same locations, listening to the same NPCs talk, often about the same damn things, and then the time skip feels irrelevant because most NPCs don't visibly change in the 5-year gap. Hear me out. Every single chapter in this game revolves around the same formula, wherein you start at the hideout, proceed to travel to a sub-zone to complete MMO fetch quests, followed by a story-heavy combat section. This almost always ends on a cliffhanger, forcing you back to the hideout so you can do more fetch quests. While you're doing this fetch quests, usually the story will have it that you're doing these because someone needs to form the next plan of attack, or the side quests are to help you construct something for the next plan of attack. You repeat this process ad nauseum until the end of the game. This game at times feels just as linear as Final Fantasy XIII, but in an even worse way, in a somehow circular way. Somehow 16 has found a way to be both linear and circular. At least in 13, that game took you and the characters on a journey through a world, from one zone to the next, with minimal backtracking, if any, until chapter 10 or 11. In fact, I don't think you do backtrack at all until those chapters. Now, yes, that game didn't give the zones time to breathe, but they still felt like they were part of a larger world because of how you traversed them. In 16, you're anchored to a base of operations that you constantly return to. There's no traveling through a zone, following a story, which leads you to the next zone, uncovering the world of Valisthea. For a Final Fantasy game, it is truly sad that there's no journey. Another negative point is the bad immersion. What kills immersion is the fact that the game is missing this coherent world. You only get small maps connected by a world map where you can teleport to the next point in the main story. And while yes, you can choose to go wherever you want for side quests at any time, that actually makes the world feel even less coherent and smaller, because there's no sense of how long it takes to get from point A to point B. Because for us, the player, it's instant. And because we spend so much time going back and forth between these zones instantly with no time in between, it also makes the world feel like it doesn't have stakes. Hell, even when Odin forms that force field around Ash, or that area of Ash, the game still allows you to fast travel back to the hideout. It just doesn't feel like a living world. It feels more like you're playing through chapters of a story. I love getting sucked into an FF game, and Final Fantasy always did this for me, but this game just doesn't. It does at points, like you feel great fighting a godlike enemy and you're totally immersed, but then suddenly you have to watch through multiple cutscenes for like half an hour. It's this stop and start that really kills the momentum and thus immersion for me. But it's not only because of this. I also think there's really no good world building. In Final Fantasy X, for example, you had a big world where you, at first, play a small role. The world lived without you, and it felt like it lived without you. Final Fantasy XVI's world feels shallow. It seems to exist solely for you. It doesn't feel like there's a lot going on in this world when you're not there. Now, I know someone will point out that, oh, well, when Clive's not there, there's this massive geopolitical storyline going on in the background. But that's also a problem. That storyline is so disconnected to the story that we do get to experience, because the geopolitics of Valisthea have virtually no bearing on Clive's experiences after the demo section. They only affect the gameplay slightly because it makes it so when you do go to certain locations, they're swarming with enemies because they're in the middle of a war or something. But aside from that, these events have no impact on Clive's quest, his motives, his thoughts, or his feelings. So you have two totally different stories going on that have basically no intersection, despite the fact that these stories should both be important to the realm. Now, speaking of what I just mentioned, we never get to see those spectacle-heavy locations in their splendor at times of peace. That is another major problem for me. This robs us of getting memorable and iconic Final Fantasy locations that we'll remember for years to come. There's no Balam Garden or Midgar or Village of Mist or Alexandria or Besaid or Clara or Phantom Forest or Luca or Gold Saucer or Bujerba. All the visually striking locations in this game are places that we only get to go to while they're being ravaged by war or by an aether flood, and then we never get to return to them. We never get to explore Twinside or Oriflame, however you pronounce it. But we sure do get to explore the marshes around Martha's Rest, I guess. So is Martha's Rest meant to be the memorable, nostalgic, iconic location in this game? Aside from that, there's really just the hideout, but we spend so much time there that I dread going back. In those past games, I never dreaded going back to Besaid. I never dreaded going back to Alexandria. In fact, I was always excited when the story got to go back. But in this game, anytime I have to go back to the hideout, I'm like, okay, so I'm going to talk to Vivian, I'm going to talk to Tomes. Like, it's just repetitive and small. Also because of this, certain moments which should feel like major story beats end up feeling unimportant or insignificant. For example, Clive finally returning to Rosalith. It's just bam, he's in the city, he got smuggled in or whatever, and he's in combat. There's no cutscene of him returning, breathing in the air, dealing with what his home has become. The story doesn't let this moment breathe because Rosalith is not an explorable area, it's just a dungeon where you're not able to return to. It's like in Final Fantasy XIV. In that game, both Doma and Alamigo were made 4-man dungeons instead of explorable cities, and almost everyone I've spoken to hates that decision. So it's kind of mind-boggling that the same team for 16 is the team from 14. So why did they do the same thing here when so many 14 players hate that decision with those locations? I'm also going to talk about the side quests again. Once again, I know they're not the centerpiece, and I know they do provide some good exposition, but they are way too dialogue heavy at times, to the point that they feel like they're just padding. Most of the side quests are also extremely redundant story-wise. How many times do we need to have it shoveled down our throats that Clive's allies are morally good, or that the people are poor and dying? This game has exactly 2 good side quests, and they're both in more. The game also tries to tell story through gameplay at times, which is a great idea, however, 16 fails at it. They fail at it because the gameplay of some of these quests is so mind-numbingly bad. One example, there's a scene where you have to collect sand from some certain river. If this obvious filler had to be included at all, this should have just been a cutscene, where you get to watch the characters advance their relationships and the story, but instead, the game has you run around seeking the right sparkling thing on the ground to interact with, and it's just a tedious, very small amount of payoff in the context of a quest that is already entirely sidelined to the main drama going on. Now, I know this can seem contradictory because at times I'm saying there's too many cutscenes, but at times I'm saying you could make this a cutscene, but that's because the cutscenes could just be more focused. Some of the main cutscenes are so long and expository where the dialogue can really be more concise to make room for more cutscenes that build character interaction and build characterization. Speaking of the characters, that's what I'm going to talk about next. Overall, I think the characters are weak. Clive and Cid are the only exceptions. The other characters are either bland, underdeveloped, one note, or cut down before they have a chance to really become something special. For the sake of time, I'm only going to talk about the dominants and the main villain. Before getting into each character individually, one major complaint I have about the characters as a whole is that the core characters already know each other from before the start of the game. I think having Clive, Joshua, and Jill already be close before the events of the game, and then having them become the main core party members later on, robs the player of the chance to see them grow as friends. I think that's why Cid is the most effective party member. We get to see him and Clive's relationship grow, from Clive being initially kind of annoyed or unsure about Cid, to having him eventually really appreciate and kind of revere him. Part of the magic of past Final Fantasy games is seeing these bonds form, seeing Zidane and Dagger become lovers, seeing Tidus start to revere Auron as time goes on, instead of seeing him as like an annoying stepdad, seeing Wakka grow a soft spot for the Al Bhed through his travels with Riku. Clive is a good character. He does feel boring at times, but I think that's just because he's the one constant in the game from the very beginning to the very end, and thus he has the burden of shouldering the entire narrative. His own goals are really the only ones that the story actually concerns itself with, so at times that can make him feel oversaturated, if that makes sense. But I do like his backstory a lot, I like his visual design, he's acted well, and I think he's written mostly consistently. Is he my favorite Final Fantasy main protagonist? No, but I'd say he is upper middle of the pack. Joshua was a very boring character to me. Now I'm not sure if this makes much sense to say, it may seem a little contradictory, but I both like that the game surprised me with the fact that he was still alive, because I truly didn't see that coming, but also I wish he had stayed dead, because him being alive lifted too much of the burden from Clive's shoulders and removed the revenge aspect of the game entirely. Once it was revealed that Joshua was alive, he just seemed too Deus Ex Machina to me. He was too aware of the inner workings of Ultima's plot, he somehow knew about Ultima right from the start, and he was also too morally pure. He just became totally uninteresting to me. There was no gray area with him. And the game really never lets us know how he knew about Ultima's plot from the first place. Joshua just became this exposition character handed to you on a silver platter. Cid is easily the best character in the game, because he feels human. He's quippy and dimensional. Even in the worst of situations, it's nice to have a character with some levity to them, and that's what we got from Cid. This makes him feel real and relatable. Sometimes when people are down in the dumps, one person does crack a little joke to try and put a smile on people's faces. And it's hard to root for people who are just consistently serious. Sometimes Cid does get a little too cool guy syndrome where he just has too many one-liners, but I'll take it. He was a joy to have around. Benedikta was the epitome of wasted potential. She was easily the most interesting character in the first few hours of the game. She was complex, she had human emotions, mysterious and unclear motives, and she was morally kind of gray. Obviously she was a villain, but I felt like there was a potential to have her kind of switch sides. The decision to kill her off so early in the game will go down to me as one of the worst mistakes of this entire story. It made no sense to kill her off before we got to see what her true intent was with the Barnabas and Kupka storyline, or to even see more of her storyline with them, see more scenes with them. It really felt like we were maybe 40% through her character arc, and then poof, she's gone. I was actually shocked when I realized she was dead. I thought we were going to see another cutscene where she was still alive, wandering back to Ash. But when I found out she was actually dead, it took me off guard, and losing her so early also left us devoid of a face to call the villain for a while afterwards. Instead, we spent the next 10 hours with the faceless The Empire as the villains, which wasn't as compelling. I did like the character of Kupka. I thought he had some potential, but again, it would have been nice to see more of him before Benedikta's death. Prior to her dying, we only saw them flirt in the demo briefly, and then the next time we see him, he's just pure rage, because she had just passed. I love seeing a character that is fueled by rage, but it would have been nice to see why Benedikta meant so much to him, and if he really meant anything to her, if Barnabas meant anything to her, or if she was just invested in Cid. The game lightly suggests that, but I think it needed to be explored more. All we get to see Kupka as a result, is him just a one-dimensional angry monster. I also think Dion was super underdeveloped. I really think the game could have explored his relationship with Joshua more, and maybe had him and Clive meet once or twice before they fought, to give the fight against him some emotional weight. It actually reminded me a lot of Cid Reigns from Final Fantasy XIII, where we know we have an ally on the inside, but we have to fight him before we really care about him. Barnabas was another character that I felt was very wasted potential, but in his case I really didn't care as much. He just felt like an extension of Ultima. It did feel like the game wanted to explore more about his mother, because why include her at all if you're really not going to delve into their relationship at all? Like, they showed some weird scenes with them together, but then never expand upon their relationship. It was just kind of teased. So that was another thing that really made me feel like, oh, this was meant to be fleshed out more, but the game was either rushed or unfinished. I thought Anabella was an interesting character who unfortunately had a really poor conclusion to her story. Her story really did have very little connection to the main story because, again, the geopolitical aspects of 16's world had virtually no effect on Clive or his party at any point, but I did like that she was someone without any powers or fighting ability who had still caused so much mayhem and destruction through nothing but her pure hatred and political maneuvering. It just would have been nice to get Clive's perspective on how he felt about his mother. How did he feel about not being loved? How did he feel about her betraying him? But he really never comments on it, other than a few things in Eastpool where he's just like, my mother did this. Okay, but like, how do you feel? What do you plan? But he never has any plans to do anything about her. He just knows she exists out there, but he has no real interest in going for her or trying to convince her of anything at all, at any point. I suppose I also just can't see how her story could have ended any other way, but I think that is more of just a product of how disjointed it was from the main story of Ultima. Once we got to Twinside, the story just needed to finally go after Ultima. So by that point, it was just no time left to explore this political storyline, so there was no further use for the slow-burning political set pieces. It was very late seasons of Game of Thrones, where the political storylines just stopped mattering. Next up is the main villain, Ultima. In my opinion, he is not a great villain. He has zero charisma, zero human essence, and no real understandable or sympathetic goal. Not every villain needs these things, but in a story that feels so gritty as this one and feels so realistic in a fantasy world, it helps to have a villain who has at least one of those traits. Going from Benedikta, Hugo, and even Barnabas' cult leader ranting, and then Anabella and the Emperor's plotting, going from all of that to Ultima's rambling about mythos, logos, mythos, it's so staggeringly a huge downgrade. I did really like his design though. It felt very old school Final Fantasy. However, overall, Ultima feels almost like Necron from Final Fantasy IX, but if Necron had been the main villain in that game. Just this otherworldly thing that comes in at the end with no real attachment to what's going on, except here, he's here for half the story. Okay, now on to the worst and most disappointing character. Jill is the one true constant through the game, other than Clive, and she offers nothing. She sucks the energy out of virtually every scene. She has no characterization, no personality, and no perspective. She has nothing that makes her memorable other than being a girl who wears blue and is Shiva. She may as well just serve as Clive's inner monologue. They're always either agreeing wholly or disagreeing briefly to a very minute degree, to whereas they'll reach a compromise within seconds, and it just makes these conversations between them just feel like padding to an already long game. Her romance with Clive is also very odd to me personally, since they had grown up as kind of step-siblings. I'm not sure how long they lived together, but they certainly lived together and seemed very close as children. Then they reconnect after all these years and have no chemistry or any hints of romance or any scenes hinting that they have feelings for each other. It's just bam. They almost kiss in that Eastpool scene, and that establishes to the player, oh, these characters are in love. But there hasn't been any legwork required to make this feel believable or organic or earned. In past Final Fantasy love stories that feel believable, the characters that are going to be in love have a little bit of teasing between each other. That's flirting. You see Rinoa really kind of get Squall out of his shell. You see Aerith really tease Cloud. You see Zidane flirt like hell with Dagger. But in this game, they're really just party members, and then suddenly, oh, they're in love, okay. The other thing that makes characters interesting is small talk and little nothings, banter. But she's always business with Clive. She always just talks business. There's no banter, no jokes, just matter-of-fact statements. Even with Sid in the room, who is really funny, she doesn't really say much, and she just stands there like a third wheel. Next, I'm going to talk about the story itself, and I may make some more comments about the storytelling or the characters where it's relevant. I do bounce back and forth a lot, but again, I think it is all relevant to the greater picture. The story of Final Fantasy XVI attempts to explore themes of greed, corruption, revenge, and avarice, but unfortunately it fails to effectively convey them, with the exception of the revenge storyline, which falls off halfway through. This is largely due to the pacing of the game. Its stop-and-go nature can cause players to lose track of their objectives, or worse, lose interest. The inclusion of tedious side quests contribute to this problem, but the main culprit is the poorly written script. Characters often engage in long, expository dialogues that could have been written more concisely and more impactfully. It initially succeeds in engaging people like me during the first 10 hours or so, but this approach becomes so increasingly frustrating as the game progresses. It started off really strongly. The prologue was good, and the bits following the other dominants were good, but eventually it basically dropped every pretense of a complex political tale and just went straight for the weird pseudo-religious angle. The lack of impact on the political storyline with Clive's personal story felt like a major miss, which could have given this game a stronger identity. The game was obviously heavily influenced by Game of Thrones, which is almost entirely fueled in the early seasons by the political storylines. But in this game, the Empire moving from Sanbreque to the Crystalline Dominion had really no effect on anyone except Vivian at the Hideout, who in fact appears 30 hours later than she should in the main story. Other than that, I did mostly enjoy the story itself. I just wish it had been more fleshed out. There were so many lingering questions or things that felt like they needed to be explored more. For example, why was Torgal with Sid? That just felt really convenient. It felt like a convenience for the plot. It made no sense that Clive's long-lost dog just happened to be with Sid, who he needed to find to progress the story. Also, what happened to Leviathan the Lost? If Ultima needed Clive to absorb all the icons, which I believe he did, wouldn't it have been really essential for him to have also absorbed Leviathan? How does an icon even become lost? But again, none of this is explored. There's not even a Tomes entry about it. This is something that either feels like it was cut for time, or like it's going to be a DLC. And I fundamentally do think DLC has ruined gaming, because companies now feel content to release unfinished products because they know they can just patch things in later. The biggest plot inconsistency to me is Sid's plan to destroy the Mother Crystals. For hundreds of years, the world has established that the Mother Crystals are essential to life. They fight wars over the Mother Crystals. I understand Sid's logic, and I think it's an interesting concept, really, that they have to destroy the Mother Crystals. But too many people just agree with him, because the game just needs them to agree. The game doesn't have time for them to ask questions, because it has too much time dedicated to you doing worthless side quests. I'm not living in the world of Valisthea, so it's easy for me to agree with Sid's plan. But these are characters who we need to believe exist and live in this world. We need to believe they live in a world of extremely limited and increasingly finite resources, for which the Mother Crystals have been their only salvation for hundreds of years. Yet all these characters that occupy this world are so gung-ho with, yeah, okay, let's destroy them, without much hesitation at all. That just seems really unbelievable to me. Made worse is the fact that they don't see any positive effects after destroying the first one, or even the second one. If they had destroyed the first Mother Crystal and saw the blight start to recede in some places, sure, then that makes sense that these characters would say, hey, Sid was onto something, and continue the plan. But in fact, not only do they see no positive changes after destroying Drake's head, but things actually get objectively worse in their world. The blight continues, and wars become fiercer because now there's one less Mother Crystal. Resources are more finite. At this point, wouldn't it be more believable for the characters to say, oh yikes, we just took away literally 20% of the world's resources, and destroying it also released those weird-ass Ultima monsters. Maybe this plan isn't right, maybe we should reconsider. But nope, They just blindly continue on destroying the others with no proof that this plan is working at all, and no regard or concern that they may be hastening the depletion of the world's resources. This is simply not believable decision making and kind of ruins the story for me a little. It ruins, again, the immersion. I want to see believable characters who behave believably in an unbelievable world. And that's not too much to ask for, because that's what we've gotten from most of the other games in the series. We know chocobos aren't real, we know mother crystals aren't real, we know magic isn't real, but these characters need to act like they are. But they don't. They destroy the mother crystals because the story needs them to, not because it makes sense. And I think that's a problem with the game's story overall. People are just way too accepting of stuff. For example, when you first see the machine things in Phoenix's Gate, great, there's some mystery. But then a few hours later, you randomly see them in the overworld, and it's not even a cutscene. You literally just walk past them on the way to Port Isolde, and Clive and Jill have a few lines of overworld dialogue where they're like, what are these things doing here? Weird, let's look into it later. But then it's never addressed. This is not believable, because to me, the characters wouldn't pass these. They would pause and be like, wait, this is very important. These are those creatures that we had never seen before that looked like living entities created by the Fallen, and we had only seen them deep under Phoenix's Gate. Now they're in the overworld. This could be a major problem. Why is this happening? Now maybe we should explore where they came from and what their goal is. But Clive and Jill just don't care. They just walk past, and then they never comment on them ever again. And not only do they not comment on them, the populace at large never comments on them. You never walk by an NPC in Martha's Rest or Lost Wing who says, did you see those machines with the glowing blue blades? They never comment on, did you see those weird creatures with the glowing swords? It's just like they've been there all along, but we know for a fact that they haven't been there all along, because when we see them in Phoenix's Gate, they're new to Clive and Jill. This story also became very repetitive, beyond even the gameplay. Every time you go to a new spot, we have to meet some new liaison of Sid's or the Hideouts who has some secret spy nickname like the Dame or the Desert Hare, and they give us some special pin so we can be identified as their ally. And all of our allies are all secretly helping the bearers for no personal gain, because they're all pure and good and have zero depth to them. I feel this game also needed to flesh out a lot more about the Fallen. I feel like we got several inconsistencies about them, and most of them were vague summaries, but knowing what happened to them and why would have been more essential to understanding Ultima as a character and understanding what we needed to do to avoid the same fate. My last story complaint is about Clive as a protagonist, and more specifically his goals. Like I said, I do like him as a character. However, I feel like Joshua being alive ruined a lot of Clive's personal momentum. Clive being driven by revenge was good, but once Joshua was revealed to be alive, what was Clive's motivation moving forward? Just to save the world? A motive like that is so morally clear and unambiguous, and so universally agreeable that it just isn't interesting. I think he needed either a motive that's more gray or some personal connection to the villain to drive him forward. But Ultima didn't do anything to Clive, he just called him Mythos a bunch. So what is Clive's personal goal other than to rid the world of the Blight? To find out more about Ultima? Why? What's driving that? Did Ultima do something that Clive needs to find out? If Ultima had been the reason that Rosalith fell, sure. Or if Ultima was flat out like, I'm the reason you specifically are Ifrit, and I made you kill Joshua, then sure, those are easy fixes for this issue. But as it stands, the only thing Ultima had personally done to Clive is kill Sid, but Clive really never talks about that as a motive. He just wants to learn about Ultima because that's what the game needs to happen, not because Clive as a character is given any personal drive to do so. There's not a carrot provoking him onward, like a carrot on a stick, and when Clive finds out that Ultima wants him to absorb the other icons, Clive doesn't even ever stop to say, okay, I'll stop doing that. Or he doesn't say, I will continue, but only because I have to. He just keeps doing it for no discernible reason, while knowing all the while that it's feeding into Ultima's exact plan. As a final complaint about Clive, I think he became much weaker as a character once the brand was removed. However, I do understand that that kind of had to happen for the story because it allowed him to more easily traverse the world and get information from non-allies. But at the same time, I think that did have a hand in the story becoming a lot less dark overall. The story actually felt like it became less dark really as soon as you defeat Typhon and there's that first 5-year time skip. That's not to say that a story needs to be dark to be good, but it did give this story a very specific tone, and it made the story feel to me a little tonally inconsistent. This story can actually, in my opinion, be broken into 3 different sections of quality. The best portion being the beginning through Cid's death. That section is definitely the story at its best. Then the story is okay from there through the Bahamut fight, but then after Bahamut it just feels mostly downright bad, because everything starts feeling more rushed and more vague. Now, all of this is also not to say that the story isn't still dark after Cid's death, but it's kind of a different type of dark. Prior to Cid's death, it's this weird, foreboding, gritty darkness with peaks of otherworldly mysteriousness that peek through. But after Cid's death, it just doesn't feel the same. It never seems to capture those heights. I'm gonna bounce back to this point again for a second. But thinking the game felt rushed or unfinished, I have to mention the medicine girl. I know I'm not the only one that felt like she was going to be a bigger character, maybe like she was going to be Leviathan the Lost. As soon as they first show her and there's an active time lore thing for this random medicine girl, it makes me think, oh, she's going to have some significance. And then she shows up again, and a third time. It all felt very convenient. There must be some mystery with this girl. Maybe in a post-credit scene, it just revealed that she's still an icon. But no, it never really goes anywhere. It felt like this was another one of those plot threads that they had in mind, but they just didn't finish. One last complaint I have, and I know I've probably said that 100 times, so maybe I should just start saying another complaint I have, is that this game, like all recent Final Fantasy releases, wants to be really flashy and really epic as early as possible so it can grab you. Right from the start, there are epic cutscenes and epic battles, but to me, a story has to progress. It has to build to something. When you start with something super epic looking, you have to either consistently stay at that level or get more spectacle heavy to the point of hyperbole. Otherwise, it just feels like, oh, why is this boss fight against Joe Schmo or this random encounter against bandits or random animals a threat at all? We've seen Clive level entire zones with explosions and fight things that look like gods. In 16, there is no slow build-up. Think back to the first few hours of any Final Fantasy game 1 to 10. When any of those games had big spectacle moments in the first few hours, it was usually at the detriment of the main cast. It was showing off the power and the force of the enemies we were fighting against, like Shinra dropping the plate onto the slums, or Queen Braun destroying the theater ship, or Sin destroying Xanarkand. These showed us the might of our enemy, and told us, through doing that, this is how strong you have to become through your adventure. Meanwhile, also in earlier games, the party members would start with nothing but basic auto attacks and spells that looked like little puffs of fire. The boss battles would be against more mortal-looking enemies that posed no threat to the world at large, like the mechanical spider from 8, the plant brain from 9, that octopus squid thing that Riku and Tidus fight in 10. They didn't feel like threats to the world, but they felt like legitimate threats to our cast, because we hadn't seen our cast fight gods yet. It gave us room to build up to a fight against something that could destroy the world. These fights allowed us to feel an organic progression to bigger and badder foes. But in 16, right from the start, your character fights like a super epic badass, and we see Jill as Shiva fight Titan, who's the size of a skyscraper. So we already know, right out of the demo, that Jill and Clive are major forces to be reckoned with, because the game doesn't trust its audience to latch onto anything unless they're impressed visually immediately. And maybe they're right. Maybe audiences do need to be visually dazzled within the first hour, but to me, this always feels like it removes a lot of the stakes. One thing I found interesting about the story is that in ways it is very similar to aspects of Final Fantasy IX's. Ultima's goal is very similar to Garland's from 9. They're both otherworldly beings who want to harvest energy of another planet or continent in this case to revive their race or compatriots, and they both have some big thing to put on this new planet or continent to help them harvest the energy. Garland is Ultima, the Aoife tree is the Mother Crystals, and Barnabas is like Kuja if he had been like brainwashed the entire time. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but I do think they could have made even more ways to differentiate them, maybe by letting Ultima tell us more about the Fallen and more about the origin of his people, the origins of his plan, how it would work. It just needed to be explored a little more. And we have reached the ending. One aspect of the game that I've seen most people agree on hating is the ending. Now, whether Clive or Joshua or Dion survived at the end is almost besides the point. Yeah, you can piece together some clues to figure out what you think happened, but there needs to be more emotional payoff. Imagine how much weaker Final Fantasy IX's ending would have been if it only hinted at Zidane's survival and did not feature his reunion with Dagger, or if 8's ending didn't show Squall on the balcony. It's not enough for the audience to figure out what happened. They want to see characters interacting with each other. In the post-credits scene, we see that the world is rid of magic. I don't hate this. It's something we've seen before in Final Fantasy VI, and I didn't hate it then either. I might have liked to have seen more of than a little cottage though. Show me what an actual village looks like without magic, and not just this lady in the woods with her kids. But also, did Joshua actually write this book? Or was this meant to suggest that this was all a storybook, a la it was all a dream? If Joshua did write it, how? When? The last 15% of the main story just felt like such a mad dash to the ending, after meandering so long to get there, that it really did not feel satisfying or well developed. So those are my thoughts. I haven't timed this out, but I'm sure it's going to be a lot longer than I planned it to be. But hey, I waited a long time for this game, and I spent a lot of time playing it, so I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about it. I tried to keep my thoughts as organized as possible, so I hope I at least succeeded in that. At the end of the day, I'm still a massive Final Fantasy fan, and I always will be, for all the memories the series has given me and for making me who I am today. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't disappointed with the direction the games have been going with the last 2 major releases. Overall, I'd rate this game towards the bottom of my series ranking, but probably still ahead of 15, but I may need to stew on that a little more. I'd definitely place it around 8 and 13. I'm just not sure which order I'd put 8, 13, and 16 in. I really did try and hold out judgment for a while with this game while playing it, but I think for a lot of it I was in denial. At the 70% mark, I looked at the PS5 home screen, saw that I was 70% through, and I was in disbelief. I found myself just wishing it was over or closer to being over because it was dragging on so much at that point and I felt so bored. And I think that's when I finally admitted to myself that I was not enjoying the game. And it is okay to admit that you didn't enjoy something that you spent a lot of time on. It's okay to admit you didn't enjoy something that you spent a lot of money on, or that something wasn't good that you were initially excited for. I'm happy if you liked this game, and I'm hopeful that the next one is one that I'll like. I just wish it was coming sooner. I wish we could live in a time like the 90s, where we got a new Final Fantasy every year. So even if one was a miss, it wasn't a big deal because hey, another one will be out next year. As a kid, I was sure we'd be at Final Fantasy 30 by now, but hey, that's where we are. Now games take 6 or 7 years to come out and don't feel half as finished as they used to. We'll see how I feel about Final Fantasy 17 in 5 years. For anyone who did stick out the whole video, thank you so much. Please subscribe. If I see any type of reaction to this video, maybe I'll start making other types of reviews or something. I am going to start streaming more on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/overnightsiryn. So if you kind of like my vibe, I guess, feel free to subscribe there. I promise I'm not always this negative, but I am always this analytical because I take the things I spend my time on very seriously, and I take the things I care about, like Final Fantasy, very seriously. Anyway, that's everything. This has been Overnight Siren, and please let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree.